Did you grow up thinking that the Empire was basically a good thing?
Well, I suppose, you know, you thought it was a wonderful thing. Well, we did when we were children. We thought it was wonderful. But then you really didn't know anything about it. That's what I found out.
Adapt to England.
She didn't want to come back to England. She said one thing she was quite clear about was that she didn't want to come back to England and possibly return to mother after 15 years. They'd been married then. And she got this animal welfare work which she was doing, and she organised a couple of veterinary hospitals, and she'd stay on.
I was born and brought up in the southeast of England in a middle-class family. We hadn't really had any contact with anyone from overseas. After the war, I went to work with an Indian, and it was through him that I met many others, among them being my husband. And he had come over here to train with the Royal Navy. We were married in 1952. I had a little girl in 53, and in 54, I went back to India. I'd been in India 18 days, and his ship sailed on. He went off with it, and I was left alone in Bombay, not knowing anyone. And at that time, most people were speaking Hindi, so I didn't know the language either, and I felt pretty miserable. It's very difficult when you first come back, isn't it?
It is.
It's very difficult.
But it wasn't so bad then, because people weren't so keen to live in London, because they were still being bombed, you see.
Oh, was it during the war?
Oh, yes,
Oh.
yes. So I found somewhere to live all right.
Yes, as you say.
On our own, we had to go in groups.
But then,
It was really very frightening. I mean, I was born in Madras in 1939. My father was an agent in the Imperial Bank of India. We moved to Bangalore, where we lived, I think, at 5 Cunningham Road, Bangalore. I can remember the address. It's quite ironic that I'm actually working here in Willesden in Brent, because I have quite a lot of Indian clients, and sometimes it feels almost like home to me to be on Willesden High Road and surrounded by women in saris and so on. It's a familiar sight. It sort of rings bells with me.
Very benevolent princes who did the best.
Yes.
I think of one or two who really did do their damnedest to produce schools and hospitals and so on. But they didn't, there was no compulsion to do anything of the sort.
I call this my India book. And that's the Taj Mahal, of course. And that's Force 136 scenes in the army. That's Breach Candy, where they wouldn't let people go in if they were suspected of having colour in the family. My favourite mongoose, my pet. We weren't a very well-off family. I mean, we had the home. Granny looked after us. I certainly had hand-me-downs all the time. Those were the Zanana, all of us together. Sisters in the house in Bangalore where we were born.
What do you mean by Zanana?
Well, the Zananas were all only women are in India. They call it a Zanana. So with my gran and all of us, we were a Zanana.
I mean, before my mother died, she had taught me the names of English plants and English trees and so on. I knew them all.
I was in India at the time of the 1943 Bengal famine, which wouldn't have been heard about much here. And I think perhaps one thing which particularly upset me at that time was that the British in India were quite deliberately going on with all their parties and their dances and so on in order to keep up their spirits among the general gloom. And I found that quite appalling. When I came back to this country in 1946, I eventually succeeded in joining the Labour Party. I had tried before when I was in the Indian Army. I wrote to the Labour Party, and my letter was returned from base censor on the grounds they couldn't allow that sort of activity or those sort of letters and communications in wartime. But it was 46 that I eventually joined. I was a councillor for Handsworth for 10 years and represented it as an MP for 4.
you wouldn't recognise Charing Cross as you come into it.
I shouldn't think so. When you say as you come into it from the Mysore side, or
No, as you come in
The
from the
Connaught
Connaught
side, yes.
side. Well, even the Mysore side.
my mother's father had a tea and coffee estate up in the Nilgiris in South India. My elder sister already married somebody out in India. So my mother wanted to take me and my younger sister out there to join, what used to be known as the fishing fleet, I suppose. I had a very nice job with the Daily Mail, so I didn't really want to go at all, but
What was the fishing fleet, Jean?
The fishing fleet was young girls whose mothers thought they ought to get married or they wanted to get married. But I think it's terribly unfair and sexist that, we were in the minority. Why were we the fishing fleet? We were being fished for. There were far fewer girls than there were men out there. I've got quite a lot of relations who spent a lot of time in India in different jobs ever since 1700. What does that remind you of? Maharaja's throne.
How old they must be.
Yes.
They haven't even become tarnished.
Probably been carefully put away.
Mm.
What I love is all this turquoise one gets in northern India. It's so pretty, isn't it? That is turquoise, isn't it? Well,
Home to you was England, was it?
oh, definitely, yes, it always has been. Even when one lived in India out there, one always referred to England as home.
I felt 10 years younger after another lovely walk over the beautiful downland. Parts of this country might so easily be Surrey. We heard a lark's song and Lawrence found a white violet. Finding such pleasure in these little things makes me realise how much I really belong to England and what a large part our homeland plays in our lives, even though we may not think we miss these trivial daily sights very much. It does make me want to get Jill and Janet back home to England to give them the background of the English countryside and seasons.
Where did you go to school?
I never went to school. I was the exception there, in that my mother wasn't prepared to allow me to come home, sort of inverted commas, everybody called it home, even if you hadn't been there for a long time. My mother kept me out there, and as I was a girl, it didn't matter because I didn't need the education.
It was always intended we would be schooled in England because in those days people didn't like what was known as the Chi-Chi accent, you see, and if you sent children home fairly early, they didn't get it. So, well, after my father was killed, my mother managed to get us into the Royal School, Bath, which was supposed to be full-titled Royal School for Daughters of Officers of the Army, Bath. So that's where I did my schooling from the age of 10 to just 18, I think.
People of my parents' background, you did not send your children to schools in India. That was for children from a different background. It was the difference you'd see in this country between people who would send their children to a public school and people who would send them to the ordinary state school. You didn't send your children to those schools.
Actually, my great-grandfather was born in Waterford, Ireland, so we are of Irish descent. We never went to school in England at all because it was an expensive thing, and after all, our grandmother looked after us, took us under her wing, as it were, and the local education was so good. And I don't think she would have relished the thought of such distance between us and this family being broken up.
Where do you think of as your home, Vida?
22 Coburn Road, Bangalore, India. Born there, bred there, educated there. Long time ago. in the 20s. Big family, 4 sisters. Hello. 1 cousin, a girl. My grandmother, my aunt, my mother. I went to a co-educational school, like all my sisters before me. It was very reasonable. It was government subsidized, and I could have gone on from there. I got a scholarship, but it fell through. So I went off, took a shorthand typewriting course, and as soon as I could, went off to Bombay to work.
I come to the Hove Club twice a week to help out with the Ladies' Bridge Circle. Several of the ladies who play bridge here have lived in India.
There was a bias against the people who were born in India. It happened even with girls when I was working in Bombay. If you made friends with somebody, they said, don't go out with that person because he's from overseas, he's working in a bank. They're advised on the ships before they get out that they must not fraternize with the girls born in India.
And this really shattered me. It made me very anti-British, I might tell you. Very upsetting. Well, I had my future to look forward to. Who was I? Was I an Indian? No, I was a Brit. But then the Brits didn't want to know me.
In those days, I'm not saying it's like this now, but there was this strongly marked caste system. There was the ICS, and then there was the Army, and then there was the box swallows and planters. I'm not quite sure in what order they come. Then the railway people, who were sort of low. Of course, the missionaries were lowest caste as well.
When we were new to command, we went in the end to a boarding school where there were quite a lot of Indians, but of course they were always rich Indians, and some of them were titled Indians. And there was never any suggestion but that they were on a par with us. I suppose if you think of it, that in itself was peculiar, because here we were sort of middle-class British, and the people that we considered to be on our pass were in fact Indian royalty.
It was a subtle form of snobbishness, British snobbishness, and a very subtle form of apartheid, if you might say so, because we were kept apart, definitely, and others were given preference. It's same with the clubs. They wouldn't open their doors to anybody. They had to go through your history, where were you born, etc., etc., and in some clubs they were very snooty. They wouldn't allow you to join. And the same with the Indians. They couldn't join. This was one bone of contention, really, amongst very well-off Indians who couldn't understand why, because they'd had education in England, lots of them. But these rules remained. They were rigid, but wasn't said so openly. It was understood underneath everything.
Adela thought of the young men and women who had come out before her, P&O full after P&O full, and had been set down to the same food and the same ideas, and had been snubbed in the same good-humoured way until they kept to the accredited themes and began to snub others. A Passage to India by E.M. Forster, 1924.
My mother was not someone who came from the Indian background at all. Well, her family was British middle class, and she'd been brought up in this country, had worked for quite a long while because she was 34 before she married and went out to India. I think she found it a bit of a shock after working and being brought up in Surrey and London. Certainly, she went straight from the centre of London into a camp some hundreds of miles away from any town or anything else, and my father was touring, and so he'd leave her in the morning in this camp in the jungle, come back in the evening. Those are pictures of the house that we were in for a long while in Archmere.
Who's that?
That's me.
It's Grandma when she was a long time
That
ago.
was me. My father came from a family which was very much one of the old British Raj.
Where you are?
In India I was, darling. The first record we've got of anybody going out was 1776. And it went on generation after generation doing different things, largely army or military. That was when I was 5, and it was with my daddy.
Good grief. How old were you then?
21. Because my mother wanted a photograph taken when I first came to this country.
It looks different. In what way?
Yes, darling, I'm a lot older. Later on, she, I think, made her own life, which was quite a bit different from a lot that the ordinary British memsahib did. Frankly, she couldn't stand the pithering around in the morning and going to bridge in the afternoon and back to the club in the evening.
I remember very little about my mother. I was only 5 when she died. What I know about her mainly comes from the diary that she left. She kept it for a couple of years, from about 1942 to 1944, I think shortly before she died. My father was at the time a prisoner of war. I think that she kept it both as a record of the family and my sister and I growing up, and also as something in which she could confide in a way. Although she was very involved in us and how we were growing up and so on, it was obviously considered as essential to have somebody there more or less all the time to help out. Although she was clearly financially having great difficulties, there was suggestions of cutting down on the servants. There was no suggestion of not having any servants. I suppose it was absolutely inconceivable to an Englishwoman living in India at that time that one did without servants.
Hilda at Darjeeling wondered if there were any country in the world where it was so useless and ineffective to be a woman, at any rate an Englishwoman. The men she knew were busy all day and every day in work that was steadily and inexorably building their minds away from hers.
You weren't in any of the colonies, were you, Rosetta? Did you have a past in India or Africa?
How did you know I went to India?
You were in India?
Yes, I was. I was in the Indian Army. At least my husband was, in Agra. A long time ago, dear. I'm only 94. 2 spades. No good. I doubt it. 2 clubs.
There's a picture of the club that Connie used to go to in India.
This was our club, and I was the only unmarried girl with 70 men. Where is that? Yes, on the tennis court.
Oh, lovely.
1 spade, 2 hearts.
So you used to spend all day playing bridge in India sometimes?
Oh, yes. When my husband went up to court in the morning, I used to go to the club and play. He'd pick me up at 4 o'clock, or we might have tea there and stay and play bridge with him in the evening at the club.
Did you ever get bored with it?
Oh, no, he'd play all night. Loved it.
How long were you there for?
On and off, many years. On and off. Not all the time.
And did you play bridge there?
Oh, yes. Quite a bit. Because Agra was a lovely place. Very... I say, look at that. I'm going to stay here. I should get the king for my partner when I go downstairs, won't I?
So what else was there to do apart from playing bridge? How do you spend your time?
Tennis, there was tennis.
Tennis? Oh, tennis, yes. It was my a good game. I loved it. And bridge, and dancing, and a lot.
So were you a borough memsahib? Were you a borough memsahib?
Definitely, oh, very definitely. You know what they were like in the Indian Army, very, very posh.
Hilda at Darjeeling wondered if there was any country in the world where it was so useless and ineffective to be a woman, at any rate an English woman. I'm afraid I must totally disagree with this, because both my sister Kay, who's done a great deal of what would in England be called social work in India, and myself, I mean, I had my brief opportunity to be of use in India, and I took it at the time. Shortly after the war started, some RAF sergeants came up to our local club, and being white they were allowed in, of course, but they broke up the local club, got very drunk and broke it up. So after that, nobody wanted to entertain the troops anymore. When these young men came out to India, and there was nowhere for them to go on holiday, because they were not of the same social grade as some of us, I was determined to do something to make life as equal for them and as happy for them on their holidays. After all, they were coming out to protect us from being killed and probably would get killed themselves, which some of them were. I started running these empty houses, which were near me, but which I could run with my servants, as holiday hostels. The YMCA used to send up 40 men at a time to stay for a fortnight. It was just a sort of social political decision on my part.
What was your mother's attitude to politics? Indian nationalism, for example?
Oh, quite the normal one, that this was something that wicked people were doing, and they were trying to wreck the lives of everyone, and we were defending the ordinary Indian. I was always told that my grandfather had come out in the year of the mutiny in 1857. It was mentioned occasionally. I mean, there were books, there were old novels which my father had around, and it was always the mutiny, and very fortunately we had won, and thereafter Queen Victoria became the Queen Empress. It was many years afterwards, I think, I was back in this country, before I really realised that most people from India didn't think of it as a mutiny at all. I think it must 20 years or more before I didn't have to remember that in most of the company I was with in this country, I didn't call it the mutiny.
Nepal 1923, menu for dinner: clear soup, salmon, salmi of pigeon, roast mutton, trifle, tomato savoury and dessert. This was at the British Legation Camp, Pathri, on the 10th of the 3rd of 1923. Did you ever have menus like that presented to you?
I have seen them on occasion.
I don't really quite see the point of this, except just to glorify one particular family, or perhaps give children a very brief and inadequate view of what it was like. I mean, a child coming round here would think that we were just people who went out to receive presents and perhaps do a few tiger shoots and things like that, whereas there was a great deal more in India than is shown here. This is obviously the view you see from the Viceroy's palace, but there were a lot of other people who didn't live in this sort of style and wouldn't wish to be remembered in this style forever.
Bits of it are very evocative of when I was there, but only bits of it. A lot of it is more what I heard from my parents.
And to me, the odd scene of southern India means a lot. That to me is India, because that's the way I went around. I never travelled far afield or to big hotels. I just went to friends' houses, stayed with them, and felt and breathed India and talked India with various people, spoke the language.
on the whole, history that's written until recently is the history of the privileged, isn't it? It's the history of the people at the top, and men and not women. Women here are just consorts to the men.
Hardly visible.
Decorative pieces by their sides.
Most of the mem-sahibs got no further than uttering the odd imperative in very bad Urdu. My father, being police, had to speak the language he was working in perfectly. My mother was a bit exceptional in that she set herself out actually to learn it and spoke it quite well. And I grew up virtually bilingual in the not very grammatical Urdu, but the Urdu one talked to servants, the Urdu one talked to the villagers. I didn't think which language I was talking in then. It wasn't high-flown. An awful lot of words I don't know.
Were they concerned about what kind of English accent you had?
Not that I remember. I think they just assumed I would get the right accent.
In my mother's day in the south of India, it wasn't considered the genteel thing to do to learn their language. Funnily enough, in the north, one learned Hindustani, but in the south it wasn't supposed to be the right thing to do to learn their languages. And as I didn't actually work on the estates with the labour, which may have spoken about 5 different languages themselves, I never bothered to learn any of their language.
How did you communicate with your servants then?
Oh, they spoke English. One taught them English.
Do you speak any other languages, Vida?
I speak a bit of Tamil, which is down south, of course, better than I speak Hindi. Nothing else, no Gujarati or anything. There's so many dialects in India, it's very difficult. You pick up what you can, a smattering here and there, and it gets you by.
They're talking Hindi. Well, I come from Darjeeling, which is Gurkhali, and I'm afraid I don't speak it very well.
None of us do, but we're
None of us
do, but we...
I can tell you that if, the little word if, is Banu Dicky. That's the word if. That's about all I know.
Bexhill because my sister had lived here, and it appealed to me immensely, I suppose, because it brought back memories of India. Obviously, you live in a place, you get to know much more about it, and I learned that people sent their children here from the colonies, and in particular India. They sent them home to school here. Many of the British children came home from the age of 7 or 8 to come to school here and be educated. And this had been a popular place amongst them. Also, people had come on leave here, spent their leaves, and eventually, when they retired, particularly after independence, many of them had settled here in Bexhill.
Well, I went out back again after the kids were all married. I went back to India to help with leprosy and famine relief.
Oh, yes.
I spent a lot of time with the Tibetans.
White, black,
Blackface. What period, what year was that? Originally I went out in 1928 to my grandfather.
Yes.
And from there I got married and spent the rest of my life being a coffee planter's wife for the first 20 years, I suppose. And then at the end of the war, I took the children back to England for their education. And they got their various degrees and things. And then eventually they got married. And I was left nothing to do in Bexhill, a nice ladylike life, sitting on committees and doing coffee mornings and things of that sort, and brings and buys. And I got bored with that, and I decided I could do more in India, a more useful life.
In a hill station, suburban England enclosed you, and you saw India only through those windows of the mind that you chose to scrub clean and look through. In the outlying districts, it was different. The Deceivers by John Masters, 1952.
I was only a planter's wife for a year, and I was 28 miles from my nearest European neighbour, so one lived a fairly isolated life, really. Owing to financial restrictions and having a small child, I wasn't able to get around over India and look at the sights one would have wanted to see. I think all our family are of a fairly religious cast of mind, and at the time I was a bit worried about the church's position because I was very unhappy with my then husband, and I felt I couldn't really live up to the Christian religion, and so I started studying Hindu philosophy. It was the form of yoga that interested me most, and it's the only one. I had about 5 different books about the different forms of yoga, but this is the only one that is left, I see, to me, as far as I can find out. This is the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, which belonged to my father. He had 2 versions. This is the most poetical one, because he was obviously interested in philosophy as well. I've inherited a lot of his library. I must have studied it very intensively at some time, because I see there are a lot of marks in the things, and also some of his marks too.
When my husband asked me to marry him, I said that there were several things that had got to be sorted out first, and decisions had got to be arrived at, so that there should not be quarrels, disagreements afterwards. First and foremost, he was a Hindu, and I was a sort of a Christian, if you like. And I felt that I wanted to know what he felt about it. And he said he didn't mind which religion our children were brought up in, such children as we may have, as long as they had some religion. And I felt the same way.
So who are your neighbours in Bangalore?
On the one side, we had a Mohammedan, but you never saw them come and go. The women were in purdah. But I used to see a lot of them because I was always climbing over the wall, jumping in and being admitted. They'd always make me wash my feet, take my shoes off, play in the inner courtyard.
In India and amongst my husband's family, who are very orthodox. The brides and bridegrooms, or the brides are found and the bridegrooms are found for the children. And I didn't really approve of that. And I felt that my daughters should do as we do in the Western world, be allowed to choose for themselves. So we talked about that, and he thought that that was fair enough, and how could he argue anyway, because he was choosing for himself, you see. So he couldn't really argue. So that settled that. I don't really think there was much else. Although, on the other hand, you know, when I think about the way Indians are chosen in marriage, I think perhaps they've got one up on us. I really do. After living there, seeing it, seeing how they live, I begin to wonder if their method isn't better.
Oh, I was very much aware of my surroundings,
Yes.
all the time. But I'm a late comer, of course, to India. I only saw India through the eyes of a traveller.
I think one
From
was totally
1974.
aware living there, but that you had to lock it out. You couldn't pay attention to it. You knew that there was cruelty and dirt and animals were badly treated, but there was no way you could think about that because you had no way of doing anything about it. So therefore,
you locked it out of your mind and just went on with your living, which you had to do, really.
Did it upset you in any way or not?
Well, one did what one could, you know, for the cases that came around oneself. And one, obviously, I mean, it was horrifying, a lot of the thing, but you can't live like that when you're young and trying to make your family happy.
Yes,
I mean, if I was the sort of person that really wanted, like Kay, to do something about it, I wouldn't have been married, would I? I'd have been out working as a missionary or a nurse or something like that. I mean, how does one live in this country and see people sleeping rough in cardboard boxes around the streets and all that?
But I think that
There's
is
a lot of it if you're
yes,
living in
but
London.
I think that is another. It's totally
Yes, it is, but
different.
you can't live in a perpetual state of distress if you're going to live a normal life, can you?
I was in feudal India then, where there were the princes with enormous wealth. There were the British, who were very much the well-off and in control, and there was a great mass of the very poor people. And I think at that stage I decided purely emotionally I didn't like a world that was run like that, and that I ought to be doing something about it. I also got to know quite a lot of politically active people amongst the men who were in India in the Army and Air Force.
One could not but be aware of the extreme poverty that most of the Indians lived in. I mean, as a child, you were actually on the same physical level as beggars. You couldn't ignore them. They were squatting or kneeling, and they were about, an adult beggar would be about the same height as a child. And I do remember being surprised that people could just walk past them without paying any attention. I mean, that was something that I found quite difficult.
Late teens, when I'd become more political, I was getting very aggressively pro anything that could be called socialist, anything that was nationalist, and was getting into an awful lot of trouble with my mother's friends. I can remember one occasion at the club in the evening when I couldn't stand what was being said anymore, and I jumped in with both feet, and I'm sure made an appalling comment, and it was descended on by about 3 different people explaining how awful it was and how I was letting down my father, who was dead, and then bursting into tears, which I don't think I bothered to argue again, partly because I didn't know how to, partly because it was so obviously useless.
It has often been said that all the worst faults of the Raj, its petty intolerance, its prejudice and snobberies, its cold-hearted arrogance, stemmed from the Mem Sahib.
It's a load of rubbish.
I wouldn't say that. I think the Saabs were pretty bad.
But I don't think a lot of the English women were as stupid as they're made out.
Don't you think the people were friendly to the servants, but arrogant towards the nation or the people? On the whole, they were friendly, though I must say my father threw the fried egg at the servant quite happily from time to time.
As far as I'm concerned, I never met arrogance from anybody.
Well, you can't say our grandfather wasn't arrogant with his people.
This is a photograph of the Ayah with my son Patrick. Wonderful woman. She had lovely skin, although she was old, very wrinkled and big nose ring, and terribly fond of babies. And she always reckoned he was a good baby, strong. At night, when I'd have my bath, she'd come in from her little room outside and want to do my hair and massage me. I thought it was ridiculous, but she said, Ma'am Saab, I used to do this for the brigadier's wife in my last job. And I said, well, I'm not a brigadier's wife, and I don't want you to do these things. Thank you.
She was not much in favour of the British in India. She didn't terribly like the way that they behaved. She felt that the Indians should have independence. And yet there does, to me, seem to be a kind of unquestioning institutional racism in her attitude towards the servants. I was forced to get up after tea and go down to the stinking bazaar to retrieve my jack-of-all-trades. Rumour has it that he was involved in one of the many childish squabbles that so many of India's vast population so constantly get mixed up in. I armed myself with a dog whip just in case my fury didn't altogether carry the semblance of the ferocity that I felt, and I brought the good Anthony to heel. These little incidents are vastly annoying when one isn't feeling on top of one's form. I suppose, again, as a woman, she felt she didn't have enough authority to sort it out.
Looking back, it's quite amazing how I think one almost regarded the ordinary Indian as a member of another species. It sounds appalling, but I think they were regarded like that.
Oh, I think...
Were you aware of any British women involved in the nationalist movement?
Most people thought they were rubbish, if that's what you want to know. most of the English people who lived in India at the time just thought it was all junk.
I suppose that's because they weren't conforming.
Yes, that's right, and they thought it was just
European.
Yes, it wasn't conforming to the that's right.
In India.
How you should be a Pakistan.
Yes,
you weren't a Pakistan,
exactly.
so and the missionaries were quite another cup of tea.
Paternalistic.
I mean, again, the British looked upon the missionaries as some sort of lunatic, really and truly, basically.
Low-caste person, there was this
Yes, that's right. Yes,
low-caste.
yes,
Which meant she was sort
just rubbish.
Rather
the missionaries.
Do you think there were particularly strong ideas about what was acceptable for a young woman in the Raj?
Yes.
There must have been.
Very strong ideas. Yes.
There must have been.
You wouldn't mix with an Indian.
You wouldn't dance.
And you wouldn't, if you were in the army, you wouldn't mix with the box swallows, the people in the shops. You wouldn't mix with them either. You wouldn't. They thought they were rubbish too. So they had very strong ideas. Yes.
The Indians wouldn't bring their wives to dances or to clubs. The men would come to the clubs and dance with the English women, but they wouldn't bring their wives to let them dance with English men.
Very sensible of you for what I know about English men is.
British women were there just to live as they did in England. In fact, they lived, when I went out in '34 to the army, my father was then in the army, and they lived just like the aristocracy. We had dances on Saturday night, and we all dressed up in our long clothes and had our little programs. And on Sunday morning, we all went hunting. And then when we came back and we all had lunch, and then we went to sleep, and then in the evening we went out somewhere else, and you played golf and tennis and swam. And really, they were aping exactly the aristocracy.
It's no overstatement, but simple fact, that the women who follow, soon or late, in the track of England's victorious arms, home-loving, home-making, skilled in the law of heart and spirit, have done fully as much to establish, strengthen, and settle her scattered empire as shot or steel, or the doubtful machinations of diplomacy.
I was much amused by that quote because I see at the end the author has used the words of an old Christian blessing to draw the whole idea together, establish, strengthen, and settle. And I wonder perhaps how much it was the Christian religion that women brought with them to India has helped to establish the empire and to keep it on an even keel. But I cannot help feeling that the way the empire has broken up lately, not that I like the word empire, is partly because people are no longer interested in religion or what it can give you, or what you can give it and what it can give you.
I must say, I never saw much evidence of what I would describe as Christian ethics or Christian feeling towards the Indians from the British in India, particularly from the women. Some of the men, yes, who did, I think, work very hard in the out in the districts and so on. But I would have thought that most of the British women in India were concerned with their own families, but I wouldn't expect anyone to recognise their attitude towards the Indian people as Christian, except perhaps, let's accept the missionaries who went out, by and large, as medical and nursing missionaries. I don't see the ordinary British woman in India as a Christian in her behaviour towards them.
The women who ran their homes on lines of being kind to their servants and looking after them, which most of us did, I think.
Patronising to their servants and Lady Bountiful, perhaps, but not in terms of what I would personally accept as a Christian attitude.
What word would you choose rather than empire?
Confederation of friendly nations or something like that.
But you see, we weren't, were we? I mean, we went out and imposed our rule. We were always top dog wherever we went.
Don't you think it was better so than the sort of thing that's going on now? Look at the trouble in India now.
I don't think we have any right to I mean, any more than you would have a right to walk into your neighbour's house and take it over because you didn't like the way she looked after it. I cannot see that we can possibly, that there's any moral justification for walking into other people's countries simply because we don't like the way that they're running them.
Oh, we didn't do it for that sake.
No, we did it initially for trade, and no doubt when that became threatened, or we became threatened, we did it by force. Looking at it from where I did as a child and now as a working woman, I don't think I could have stood it. I think women made enormous sacrifices to support their husbands in India, to be there.
Yes, I'm sure they did, yeah.
Absolutely staggering.
Vee, did you feel that the women in your
I
family
seem to be a completely different case from my 3 friends or 4 friends here, because I was born there, so was my grandmother, and I looked on India as my home, my rightful home. I loved it, I loved every bit, I loved the heat, I loved the flies. We fought it, we knew how to look after ourselves. You just had to be tough. And we never thought we sacrificed ourselves at all.
I think it was easier for those that had been born there, women that had been born there,
right.
than those that came out fresh from England, because many of them suffered isolation and boredom, frustration and lack of harmony, and I don't think there was a tremendous amount of trust between servant and master, or master and servant. That also presented problems.
I think it was a very formal society.
Yeah.
It was formal in its own defence, because there were very, very few people there, and I think they felt that if they were less formal, they lost control.
I think it probably would have collapsed without the women supporting their men and providing homes for them and so on. I think it would have collapsed a great deal more quickly.
I think a lot of English men did go native, as it was called, and I think a lot more would have done so if they hadn't had English women around.
Mem Sahib is represented as being a rather tough nut, and I think although the Mem Sahibs I know I would exclude from this, I think perhaps there was this general body of women who somehow or another had to keep up an appearance of being in command, in charge, and they had to adhere together. Perhaps it was necessary that something in their lives meant that they had to keep together as a body of women and show the British flag, as it were. And quite honestly, in my travels in India, no Indian, I mean I'm talking of Indians, have ever said anything to me that's been very complimentary about the women or even the men of the Raj.
Were you aware that you were experiencing the last days of the Empire?
No, I don't think so at that time. It was just that it was in a war period, and I think the feeling and the hope probably was, once the war's over, it'll go back to the old ways.
ताजमहल है और कुतुब मीनारा है जहाँ हमारा ताजमहल है और कुतुब मीनारा है जहाँ हमारे मंदिर मस्जिद सिखों का गुरुद्वारा है जहाँ हमारे मंदिर मस्जिद सिखों का गुरुद्वारा है जहाँ हमारा ताजमहल है और कुतुब मीनारा है जहाँ हमारे मंदिर मस्जिद सिखों का गुरुद्वारा है उस धरती पर कदम बढ़ाना अत्याचार तुम्हारा है अत्याचार तुम्हारा दूर हटो है दुनिया वालों हिंदुस्तान हमारा है दूर हटो है दुनिया वालों हिंदुस्तान हमारा है आज हिमालय की चोटी से फिर हमने ललकारा है आज हिमालय की चोटी से फिर हमने ललकारा है दूर हटो है दुनिया वालों हिंदुस्तान हमारा है
I'd been home to visit my family in 1962, And I got on a ship, boarded a ship in Liverpool. It sailed away. And I was put at a table to dine by myself, as I had no one with me. And next to me was also a single table with an Indian Army officer sitting there. And after a day or two, we started just passing the time of the day, and then we started conversing, and within about 3 or 4 days, we were quite friendly. And I said to him, would you care to come and sit at my table? And he said, I'd be delighted. And the following evening, the head waiter came up to me, and he said, we have arranged for you, he said, to go and sit at that table up there with those British people.
Oh, God.
And so I turned around and I said to him, what makes you think that I want to?